in incredible times.
We are the sector.
Artificial intelligence, big data will be the future of our industries, all industries.
Countries that are going to thrive are the ones that have that ability to get technology and produce technology.
We need to make artificial intelligence human.
Everything is and will be connected.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this special broadcast discussion where we're going to be diving into the murky world of disinformation and how to deal with it. My guest today is someone who blew the whistle on the biggest data breach in the history of modern technology and one of the biggest scandals of our time. I'm referring to, of course, Brittany Kaiser. Brittany, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Justin. It's a pleasure.
Great to have you with us, Brittany. Looking forward to the next hour or so. Just before we begin, I would like to point out that we'll be making a transcript from today's broadcast available to you via email following this session. So you can all sit back, watch and interact without worrying about taking notes. And we do want to hear from you. Please send us comments and questions during the show. We will have some time later to address questions, and I know Brittany is keen to hear from you. Well, just in case there is anyone watching that doesn't know Brittany's background, she's been warning about online disinformation for years. In 2018, of course, she sounded the alarm on Cambridge Analytica's ties to Facebook, revealing the company had accessed the data of over 87 million Facebook users without their knowledge or permission, and used it to target people on behalf of the 2016 Trump campaign and the Brexit movement in the UK. Brittany is now a data rights activist and cryptocurrency lobbyist, and they're two topics among many that we'll be covering during our discussion. So, Brittany, let's start, if we can, with assessing really where we are today in relation to the scandal that you uncovered a few years back. In your book, Targeted, you wrote that your mission on whistleblowing at the time had been, and I quote, to raise the alarm about how Cambridge Analytica operated and the dangers posed by big data, so that the next time voters on both sides would understand the full stakes of the data wars that our democracy is up against. Well, of course, we've just had a very controversial US election. So, Brittany, did we learn those lessons in 2020? Compared to 2016, was 2020 a better or a worse year for disinformation?
Well, to be fair to all of us, I don't think we expected in 2020 that we'd be producing exponentially more data than ever before. That most of us would be thrust into leading a completely digital life for the first time, vastly unprepared for what that actually means for not just adults, but even children, to be forced to have screen time in order to interact with friends, family, and just to learn, let alone our lives to work. I know a lot of adults were already spending a vast amount of screen time. And so with this exponential data production, it unfortunately makes us even more vulnerable, especially when we're not so much exposed to the outside world, to face-to-face time and meetings. It means we live through our screens, and therefore our reality becomes even more distorted. In 2016, we could choose to live outside of our own devices, where in 2020, we were not given that choice. So it really did make the problem exacerbated on an exponential level. And that's what we're really dealing with right now. I think especially in the United States, with the incident at our Capitol on January 6th, we have seen the seeds of disinformation that began to be sown in around 2015, that those have finally grown into something that is much larger than what anyone ever expected disinformation to do. We now have these societal rifts We have entire sections of the population that believe in some of these concepts of disinformation, some of the fake news campaigns that they've been fed on their screens for so many years. And it's going to take a while to undo that. We do have a lot of work to do to clean up this mess.
Sounds almost as though you could kind of describe it as the perfect storm over the last year or so then, Brittany.
I honestly have to completely agree with you. And I'm an eternal optimist. So it's not a perfect storm that we can't come out of, but it is something where we have a lot more work to do than we did coming out of the 2016 elections.
It's also, I think, probably worth making the point. I mean, you're obviously best known for the work that you did on exposing disinformation and data privacy in the world of politics. But of course, disinformation in the last year or so has really spread to many areas of our lives, isn't it? I mean, I noticed that the World Health Organization labeled the spread of disinformation around COVID-19 as an infodemic, not a pandemic, but an infodemic. So it is rife, isn't it?
Absolutely. When people cannot trust the information that they are finding online, that is a huge problem, especially when it has to do with protecting themselves and their families, trying to figure out what is best to keep everyone safe and healthy. If you can't find the correct information and you unfortunately stumble upon something that tells you to do the wrong thing, then you are obviously more at risk, especially in the very beginning of the pandemic, when all of a sudden we were thrust into these digital lives. I would say some of the first talks and panels that I was doing with other disinformation experts around the world, they were seeing at least 50,000 new pieces of disinformation in the United States alone every single day. 50,000. And some of these had to do with telling people that they could treat coronavirus in a certain way or prevent getting sick in a certain way. And none of that was actually true or based on science. And therefore, that leaves people more at risk. There were even disinformation campaigns in other countries that left people in the hospital or even dying due to the types of information that they were being shown that was completely incorrect. So it is more of an issue than just a change in political opinion these days.
So obviously disinformation is rife. You said at the beginning there, Brittany, that there's a lot of work to do. So let's talk about how we could and should improve matters. Firstly, let's talk regulation and big tech regulation. How do we better regulate big tech, the big companies, the companies that we all know, the Facebooks, the Twitter, the Googles, etc.? How can we better regulate that?
So I think one of the most important parts of the conversation around regulation of big tech, especially when we're talking about disinformation and fake news, is thinking about where liability lies. And I come from a legal background, so that's really the way that I think. But if someone is going to put out a piece of disinformation that actually causes physical harm or death to people, someone needs to have liability for that. So is it the individual that posted that content, or is it the platform itself? I'm going to examine both options because both of them are talked about quite a lot, and I think it's important for people to understand the nuances of this conversation. So you've probably heard of Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act. In the United States, what that means is that big tech companies that are in the social media business have been exempted from being considered publishers. Publishers, big media organizations, usually have certain regulations that they have to abide by. They, for instance, need to do fact checking. They cannot cite single anonymous sources. This is to make sure that news organizations are printing factual information, and they're not going to slander or libel anyone when printing information about them, right? So there's a whole set of rules, ethics, regulations around what can be published by real news organizations. Social media companies, unfortunately, regulatorily are considered something different. So that means that they're not liable for any of the information that is published on their platform. Unfortunately, we're in this no man's land where it seems that there isn't anyone that holds the liability. Because if a social media company is not responsible for the content, then you would think, okay, well, maybe their users are. Unfortunately, that's not the way that it works either, because individuals are not identity checked in order to have a social media account. So if you are not giving your identity to the platform and you decide to put up a piece of disinformation that then causes people to make the wrong decision in protecting themselves and their families, then somehow it's not the social media company nor you that is responsible, because the social media company doesn't know who you are. Law enforcement doesn't know who you are. And the other unfortunate fact is that it seems that at least 60% of the accounts that are on social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter are fake in the first place. So they're not even real human beings. These are run by troll and bot farms. So artificial intelligence computers are actually running these accounts. Therefore, it means no one is held responsible. For instance, if a young family decides to feed their children the wrong type of medicine because they think that it will prevent coronavirus. So someone needs to be held responsible for that. And it's this no man's land that we're trying to figure out. Do we think that platforms are responsible enough or have the capacity to manage billions of pieces of content that are being published on their platform every day? That's an actual technical question. Can these companies do that? I believe right now that they probably could if they were to make a very large financial investment in solving the problem. I believe so far they have been unwilling, not unable, right? So they have not spent enough time and money in capacity building to actually handle this problem. And it's because the law does not force them to. On the other side, do individuals want to give up their opportunity to be anonymous on a platform publicly? Or are they willing to do an identity check in order to have a better regulated social media experience? And that's what regulators are going to be debating over the coming months when these topics are at the top of the agenda for the new administration.
But in your view, it sounds as though you would be a stronger advocate at this stage of making sure that users have their identities checked and almost, they can then be held accountable, I guess, when they start posting disinformation or worse.
Well, it's more out of my unfortunate experience of dealing with some of these larger social media companies over the past 3 years and realizing that unless they are forced by the law to make some of these changes, that they are not to be trusted in terms of being the arbiter of truth. So far, they have decided to use different censorship tactics for individuals or topics that they do not completely agree with. And that has not been regulated in any kind of normal way. So therefore, without having transparency around how that decision making is made, I don't think the platforms can be trusted to make those decisions. So assuming that most individuals are good actors and you are posting content because it's something you believe in or you want people to hear or you just feel like sharing with your community, then you should be able to do that. But if you are going to post something that, for instance, threatens someone's life, which unfortunately has been happening more and more over the past few years, then yes, you need to be held responsible. It shouldn't be an entire company that's responsible for one rogue individual coming on and doing that. But I still believe that in the meantime, when we're in this no man's land, that we need to be able to force these companies to be more ethical or at least more transparent about their decision making on whether they leave content up or take it down.
Brittany, the role of data privacy, of course, is intrinsically linked to the problem of disinformation. Data privacy, or actually the lack of, was at the very heart of the issues that you exposed with Cambridge Analytica. You've actually said that data rights should be considered fundamental rights. And really, it's the question of data rights that is the pivotal issue of this generation. But are we moving fast enough with laws and regulations around data privacy?
No, I don't think we're moving fast enough, considering that technology, especially emerging technologies, are moving faster than nearly any other industry. Technology is always going to move faster than the law, so we need more dynamic legislation. We need regulators that are more technical, and we also need more direct engagement between entrepreneurs and technologists that are building these companies and these types of solutions, and the individuals that are responsible in the government for regulation thereof. I've definitely spent a lot of the past 3 years specifically bringing technologists and legislators together, not just so legislators can understand better how the technology works. I think that will get better with time, of course, as more legislators start to be elected or appointed that grew up using technology. And so I definitely think that is getting better step by step, but also so that technologists can help legislators build new laws, build regulatory infrastructure, still allows good actors to innovate. So one of my biggest fears, and what I've seen in some countries, is that if legislators and regulators do not understand how certain technologies work, then they go the opposite direction, and instead of allowing those technologies to flourish, they decide to over-regulate, and therefore those technologies ended up getting built somewhere else or not built at all. And in general, as someone who's a technologist myself, I really do believe that most technologists and entrepreneurs in this industry are building solutions that are meant to positively affect people's lives. They're meant to change something for the better, to make our lives easier. As the late great Dr. Stephen Hawking said, you know, we are building technology so that one day we could all live in luxurious leisure. What he means by that is that technology is supposed to make our lives easier so that we can concentrate on our passions. And that is really the goal of where most technologists are going. And unfortunately, we have bad actors like Mark Zuckerberg and, you know, the former heads of Cambridge Analytica that are leading the face of the technology industry. And that's really not what it's all about. So I think it's really important for this engagement to make sure that we have regulation that stops bad actors from abusing people, but we allow people who are really building the solutions that are going to change our future for the better. We still allow those companies to build.
And when it comes to enforcing regulation, Brittany, should this be done on a local level, and then following the success of that, it builds up on a national scale and you know, ideally global, but I'm not sure if that's a realistic option there. But do we start local and then build up?
I think that's what we have to do at this point, because if you look historically, it's been quite a long time since we have, for instance, had the human right to privacy at a global level. But what has that actually meant in practice? Because, I mean, I would love to see someone go into a human rights court and try to win a case against a big tech company saying that they have the human right to privacy. It's very difficult to do. Obviously, it is a claim that many people have made. It's just a lot more difficult to accomplish in terms of actually trying to protect yourself. So starting in more local jurisdictions, especially in the United States, we're starting state by state. Even in Europe, it started country by country before there was GDPR at a supranational level. And so these are the types of issues that I'm working on now. I help multiple states in the US with state-based privacy legislation. And what we're hoping to do in a similar way that the cannabis industry has, which is to gain enough adoption of certain privacy and data protection policies across states that eventually we can find something that we can all agree upon federally, so that we would have national legislation across every United State. Similar to the way that GDPR eventually was adopted by the entire European Union, where you already had very strong privacy in countries like Germany and France, for example. So it's important to start at the local level because it's easier to implement. It's easier for legislators and companies to understand. But in the end, we do need to go back to the global level and think about certain rules that we can all live by, that we can all abide by. And human right to privacy would be great, but we need to figure out how we can enforce that at a local level before we can really say that at a global level we are all in some sort of agreement as to what rights we actually have and how we protect them.
And in terms of a kind of long-term goal here, Brittany, where could we get to with this? I mean, is it possible that one day we could maybe be rewarded for sharing our data? I mean, is it possible that we could get to a stage where we're actually monetizing our own data, do you think?
Absolutely. And I think we're already in a very good place in terms of where these conversations are going, both at a government and at a company policy level. Right now, in a few different states in the US, we do own our data as our property. And there are many countries around the world that are looking at that as national policy. If you give every individual the rights to have transparency and consent over what is done with their data, then it's really easy to incentivize citizens to decide to safely share data where they understand who it's being shared with and for what purpose, and then they get rewarded. So in terms of sharing data for government programs, for smart cities programs, we can make sure that we don't have the next traffic accident or terrorist attack or mass shooting, really incredibly important issues. On the healthcare side, if everyone's able to anonymously and safely share their medical data, all of a sudden we're going to be curing more diseases that we never thought possible. You know, right now in the medical field, most medicines that are created by researchers and pharmaceutical companies are dealing with data sets on 18 to 35-year-old young white men, because those are who go during college to medical trials for extra money because they're incentivized. If you could incentivize everyone at a mass scale, we all of a sudden are working with enough information that we're going to be able to cure illnesses that we never thought we could before. And medicines are going to start working on women and minorities as well. So it's incredibly important to think about that. You know, on the education level, we could be sharing our data in order to better inform policies and to make sure that government policies at both a local and a national level are actually working better for people and their families. There are so many reasons why I believe in data science and I believe in data ownership, and it's really because everything can function better if it is data driven. And our main issue that we have right now is that there are some bad actors that choose to abuse the way that they use data. And so we're just trying to figure out how we protect ourselves from those bad actors, but we enable all of the good actors, all of the well-meaning entrepreneurs and technologists that are out there building important solutions, and that those solutions can actually help inform better functioning government and governance, and also better functioning companies, of course. So I think it's really easy to make the case that if I was able to earn enough money to pay for my groceries by sharing my data, I would obviously do that. Most people around the world, or I would say at least the 2 billion people that live on less than $2 a day, that would completely revolutionize their lives. It's possible that if everyone was rewarded for sharing their data, that we could cure extreme poverty for everybody that is able to have a device. There are even governments that are looking into passing out devices to people who cannot afford them, even though these days the majority of the planet does have at least a basic device. I mean, a more basic phone doesn't have to be a smartphone in order to share data. And that those types of programs could allow not just people who have difficulty feeding themselves and their families cure that problem, but also solve so many other issues in society we haven't even been able to touch yet.
That really is quite an incredible goal, Brittany, and fantastic aspirations. I'm just wondering, as I listen to you, whether so far you've seen any examples of companies or countries that are at a stage of rewarding people for sharing their data and users are benefiting from that. Are we still some way off from seeing real life case studies?
I don't think we're too far off, actually. I'm actually broadcasting from Miami, where the city of Miami and Mayor Suarez are doing some of their first data-driven experiments, rewarding citizens in digital currencies in order to participate in these programs. I know Andrew Yang, who a lot of you may have heard of, who ran for president, is currently running for mayor of New York. And he believes that through data dividend program and people owning their data as a property right, that everyone could have a universal basic income based off of their data. And he plans on starting those rewards in Bitcoin, perhaps, when he is mayor of New York. So I see New York as the next experimental city after Miami. And then there are entire states that are looking at doing this in the United States. For instance, Governor Gavin Newsom in California was one of the biggest proponents of something called the data dividend law. And that meant that a law would be passed that said any of the companies that are monetizing your data would actually owe you a dividend from that. So you would earn a percentage of the value that they are creating through your personal information, and that would be paid to you. So that would be for the entire state of California, which is obviously of interest since they currently have the most comprehensive data protection legislation in the United States and are just now forming the first ever data protection commission in the US. So a lot of these experiments are starting to pop up. Some of it starts with legislation and regulatory. Some of it starts with specific politicians who are visionary. And some of it is really starting with companies. For the past many years, there have been companies that reward people for their data. And it's really something that's starting to take effect. I mean, for instance, if you wanted to protect your privacy, instead of using Google Chrome, you could use Brave browser, which pays you for all of the searches that you do, but doesn't actually collect or share any of your data. So that's just one example. I mean, instead of Facebook, you could use voice.com. Again, you're rewarded in cryptocurrencies for the content that you produce. There are a lot of options that are starting to be presented to us where the activities that we would do every day anyway, we get rewarded for those activities with value. So that value creation for ourselves means we can decide to engage further in those activities and earn more value. It's possible that if you're one of the, I suppose, hundreds of millions of people around the world now that are unemployed due to the coronavirus shutdowns, that you would be able to at least take care of your basic needs by using all of these different platforms that pay you for your time and attention, even if you didn't have a traditional job. So I think these concepts are really important when we're thinking about the future of work and how we make sure that people can still take care of themselves and their families, even if their job doesn't come back anytime soon, which is what we're being faced with.
Yeah. Brittany, you're clearly very passionate about spreading your message around the value of data, the issue of data privacy, the problem that disinformation causes as well. I'm wondering what else do we have to do to educate consumers around these issues? I mean, how big an issue is digital literacy in the world at the moment? Do we have to take this back to the classroom, I guess? I mean, are we starting at the right age? Because that surely is a big challenge, right? It's actually getting people to understand the issues that are out there.
Absolutely. And I think to really land the plane about how big the issue around digital literacy is to take back to the first time any of us touched a computer. There was someone that told us, hey, here's a computer, here's a keyboard. This is how you use it. This is how you type into a search engine in order to ask a question and get an answer. This is how you type to send an email. But no one ever told us that everything that we're typing is being recorded. No one ever told us that everything we're typing could be sold and traded around the world and bought by anyone and used for any purpose without our permission. I think if when we were younger, that was what we were told when we were sat in front of these machines, we maybe would have lived our lives differently. We maybe would have used these technologies in a different way. But today we can actually have those conversations with children. There's a new program that's out that we teach at the Own Your Data Foundation called DQ. And DQ, just IQ, EQ, is a digital intelligence quotient. And so we are going to start globally. This has already started for the past year, being implemented globally as an IEEE global standard that has been developed over the past 10 years, that we can actually measure how digitally intelligent people are. So do you understand your data rights? Do you understand basic cybersecurity protocols? Do you understand what your digital footprint is and what that means for your digital reputation? How can you use emotional intelligence when you're online, even if you're anonymous? And how do you use that digital empathy in order to become a good digital citizen in the same way that you would think about your physical or analog life? And then there's even other important concepts like, how do you protect your physical and mental health when engaging with technology, especially these days when we're forced to be on it all day and night long. So how do you rid yourself of those device addictions that are especially prevalent if parents allow their children to use devices too much when they are young? And unfortunately, they're being forced to do digital schooling for the past year. So there are so many different issues and concepts that come out of DQ, and this is going to be something that I think the next generation is going to have embedded from their very first classes. The general program is meant for both parents and teachers to learn a bit more about these topics, but also to be able to help children through these programs so that they feel like they are not just safe and protected when they're online, but that they can also be successful. We all know that technology is an essential part of our daily lives. And so instead of denying that, it's much better for all of us to be competent in how we use our devices, to be safe and protected, and to have those skills where we know that we can grow and we can be successful both in our personal lives and in our careers. So the digital intelligence concept is something that is not just going to be used in our personal lives, but is something that is going to be implemented in schools globally. There are already national programs where entire countries are implementing this into their public school curriculum. So us at the Own Your Data Foundation, co-founded with my sister Natalie, we are trying to get this into as many schools in the United States as possible, and especially in the hands of parents and teachers that are wondering how they can protect their children while they're leading now a digital life in terms of their education.
So very much about embedding it into culture, I guess, from an early age. I mean, I was reading actually that obviously many countries are at different stages of digital literacy, but Finland in Europe apparently leads the way in Europe and actually topped a European annual index measuring resistance to misinformation and disinformation. And they're actually teaching digital literacy, I think, in kindergarten, so from a very young age. So maybe that's a good case study for other countries to follow.
It absolutely is. In the state of Wyoming, actually, they started a new program called Boot Up 2022, meaning that by 2022, every school in Wyoming from K through 12 will have computer science and digital literacy education as part of their curriculum. It's the first state in the United States to do so, but it also comes from the legacy of other countries, like you mentioned, Finland, that are leading the way in making sure that from the first time that kids are touching technology, especially when it's integrated into their education, that they know exactly what they can do in order to be safe, but also successful.
Come back to a point you made earlier in the conversation, Brittany, about really pushing technology platforms that have a power for good. Do you think that there needs to be kind of a bigger push behind ethical companies that do good, that don't provide disinformation, that give data rights to people? Because I guess one of the challenges is it's so much easier for you or I to use Facebook, to use Google Chrome, than find out and have to do the research and support a company that perhaps is in startup mode as well. That's the challenge, isn't it? It's that we're surrounded by tech giants, but do we need to give more power and more funding, essentially, to the smaller companies that are trying to turn things around?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the more government programs and incentives for there to be good actors in this space that still can be successful, the better. I definitely think that between government incentives and consumer incentives, that a lot of these companies that are starting to protect data rights give us that transparency, give us that consent, and of course give us the incentive structure to want to use their platforms. Those companies in the end will be very successful. Of course, a lot of the early actors in the space have been bad actors, and unfortunately they gained mass market adoption before people even understood what was going wrong. But I do believe that over the past few years, a lot of individuals have lost trust with those companies. And when you start to compare, for instance, a Facebook feed to a social media platform that doesn't have those types of divisive algorithms, where you're not living in a bubble, and you actually start to compare your experience, an individual would be more likely to choose the ethical platform versus Facebook, which has a lot of cleaning up to do, for instance. It's not the easiest way to change the market. It's slow, but I do believe that, especially with the global momentum towards data protection and privacy rights, that there are going to be market changes that take away the power from some of these big tech companies that have not shown any real effort to protect their users or to think about their consumers ahead of shareholder profits.
Brittany, we are getting a lot of questions from our viewers, so I do want to cover as many questions as possible. Just before we get to that, obviously we have a new administration in the US, so I just wanted to touch on that, get your thoughts on how optimistic you are for the future. Do you think the new administration will take much stronger steps to address disinformation in the future?
I really do believe, in terms of all of the legislators that I interact with, that privacy and data protection is at the top of the agenda for this new administration. A lot of the legislators who have specifically led on new privacy law have been reelected. And a lot of the new people who have now taken their seats in Congress are advocates of making sure that we find some common sense regulation for this industry in order to be able to protect people more than we ever have in the past. I'm seeing some moves. I do expect a lot of congressional hearings in the coming months and new bills being introduced into Congress, as well as bills that have been sitting there for the past few years, waiting to actually be considered, to finally actually see the light of day. So I do have a lot of hope for what we're going to see over the coming months, and I will certainly be engaging as much as possible to make sure that that these bills start to get passed. We need some more federal legislation in this area, and state by state has been going well, so hopefully we do get that momentum for federal protection sometime soon.
Good to hear. Fingers crossed on that one. Let's take some questions that we've had. Brittany, as I said, lots of interaction, which is great to see. Take the first question related to ethical technology. One of our viewers asks, Brittany, how can social media platforms deploy artificial intelligence to fight disinformation? And then they go on to hit on a very controversial topic. What's your view on deepfakes when it comes to the subject of AI? Will people see through deepfakes, or do they actually pose a real threat? So AI in general, Brittany, and then deepfakes.
So I think both of these are, obviously it's been asked as one question, and it's because they're completely interrelated. So if we're going to think about programming AI in order to fight disinformation, deepfakes is one of the more complex versions of fake news or disinformation that's out there. So I have seen, I don't know, probably about 50 different solutions that are out there in the market that are tackling different ways of using data science in order to find disinformation and fake news before it gets in front of us, basically. And that is, I mean, it's a complex data science question. It's a complex psychology question in order to start to figure out what are the telltale signs of fake news and disinformation. How can you make sure that consumers are educated enough that if something that has been altered, a piece of content, a video that has been altered, that you make individuals aware of that so that they can make an informed decision about how they feel, or if it has been altered in a way that is that really has a much more likelihood to have a negative impact, that content would actually be removed instead of remaining on a platform. There's various different ways of tackling it, from being able to identify the ways that images and videos are edited to the types of patterns within language that make up disinformation, especially articles that are fake, for instance, and where all of these articles trace back to. That soon we're going to have these plugins that are probably going to be bought by bigger tech companies that solve this a lot more easily. But I think that's one component of the problem. That's the technology solution. The other side of the equation is, I'm going back to digital literacy. It's for us to understand what is fake news and disinformation. How do we spot it? How do we become conscious consumers of information so that we take some things with a grain of salt and we decide how we feel, so that we see a content more as an opinion as opposed to a fact? And so that's going to have to start stemming from early childhood education, I really believe, but also mass kind of awareness campaigns. I do believe that governments have started to make moves in order to have public awareness campaigns, not just legislation and regulation. And I think the more that us as individuals start to understand how fake news and disinformation works, it makes us, as they call, inoculated, where, I suppose I hate to use a vaccine comparison, but when you're inoculated to fake news and disinformation, it doesn't affect you. You don't actually see that as real information because you understand what it is and you can spot it from a mile away. And that's part of even the DQ program, is for you to be able to understand the components of fake news and disinformation. So even if a platform isn't flagging it for you as content that has been altered or shouldn't be trusted as real news, that you would still be able to do that for yourself.
Okay. In our discussion, Brittany, we were touching on the behavior of big tech platforms. And at the beginning, you were talking about how this kind of really blew up on the 6th of January. One of our viewers asks whether actually censoring public figures, as with obviously happened with Donald Trump on Facebook and Twitter, is censorship actually the correct way to enforce disinformation, or I guess, is that something of a last resort?
So this is one of my favorite debates, and it's because I think that the word censorship is way overused and misunderstood. Censorship means when you decide to block content or information or an individual from being able to publish it more in an arbitrary way. You are censoring someone because you don't agree with their opinion, or you don't want the content that they're posting to be seen or heard. But what the situation was, especially with Donald Trump and a lot of the insurgents that caused the violence and death around the January 6th incident, that content being removed was actually just law enforcement. So we have laws that prevent individuals from inciting violence on others. A lot of people talk about the right to free speech. So the right to free speech is not an unchecked right. my right to free speech ends where someone else's human rights begin. So I cannot say or do something that incites violence upon someone. I cannot say or do something that slanders or libels someone. I cannot say or do something that incites racial hatred or suppresses someone's vote. And so when content of that nature is removed, it is law enforcement. It is not censorship. And so I think it's very important for people to understand that nuance and what that actually means. And it took a very long time of content that could have fallen into any of those legal categories of the law being broken by content that's being put out by these individuals. It took a long time before platforms were finally forced to remove that content because it became too blatant, too obvious that that content broke the law. So, in fact, that isn't censorship, and it isn't stopping anyone from exercising their rights to free speech. That's law enforcement because someone has breached someone else's rights when speaking or when content creating. So it's very important to understand that difference and to realize that platforms, even if they're not being regulated like a media publisher, that they still have the obligation to make sure that anything on their platform is obeying the law.
Brittany, on the topic of censorship, what's your view on Parler? Because Parler is pushing free speech, but also at the same time, it's actually claiming to protect data privacy. What's your view on that?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't seen anything in Parler's terms and conditions, nor in their ability to use data that has anything to do with privacy at all. In fact, all of their user data was breached, and in even a more public way than Facebook's was. So I don't think that they can claim that, number one. Number two, protecting free speech is important, but allowing people to incite violence upon others without actually allowing the law to be enforced on your platform is also a massive problem. So we need to find some sort of balance where individuals are always able to express their voice, where you can make sure that your content is going to stay up if you've done nothing wrong and you're simply expressing yourself. But when some individuals decide to incite violence upon others or engage in voter suppression tactics, for instance, which has been a constant theme of the past two election cycles, that there is some recourse. There needs to be some recourse for that, not just content that that lives forever without the individual who put it up actually being held responsible. So there's a lot of different layers to that, of course, and we haven't found exactly what is the happy medium. We haven't found that right balance, but I do believe over the next couple of years, between legislation and regulation and advances in technology, that we will find a way to make sure that our rights are protected. And that's what this is all about in the end. We want our right to free speech protected. We want the right to remain safe and the right to vote. We want all of that to be protected online, like we expect in our analog lives. And this is really a topic that I think is important to bring up at this point, which is that a lot of the issues over the past few years are that the expectations that we have in our physical life and our analog life are not the same that we have in our digital life. So some of the things that, for instance, were published on Parler, if you were to say those things out loud in the town square, you would be arrested. So to allow that type of content or hate or violence to live on a platform when it wouldn't live anywhere in our digital life, where it wouldn't live anywhere in our analog life, is a problem. So that disconnect is something that I think legislators and regulators are working through now that they are starting to have a better understanding of how technology works and therefore how that affects our citizens.
So with all this said, Brittany, the topic of this discussion was, is disinformation a cybersecurity challenge or a digital literacy challenge? Given what we've just discussed over the last 45 minutes or so, I'm guessing that your answer to that is probably going to be both, correct?
You're completely right, Justin. And I really think that the two working hand in hand. You know, we're really talking about cybersecurity and technology solutions. And at the same time, we're talking about digital literacy, not just of us as individuals, but of our legislators and regulators, right? Everybody needs to have a better understanding of how technology works now that it is an essential part of our daily lives. And I do believe the next generation is going to have a much easier time of it than we have, of course. We're the first people to have to try to solve these problems. No one has ever dealt with these problems before. And so I do really think that, especially when we're having the private sector and the public sector work together in tandem to solve these issues, that it's going to start to pick up pace. I know it seems like it's taken many years, where these debates are raging on and things are getting even worse. But although it might look that way in the news, in all practicality, it's not. There are incredible technologists and legislators that are really understanding the fundamentals of these problems and are putting forth both legislative and regulatory infrastructure, education programs, as well as actual technology solutions that are going to make sure that the issues we're dealing with today are not something that we have to deal with in a few years. You know, I really do believe that my children will not have to deal with the problems that we're seeing today. And that's what I'm working every day to make sure of.
Brittany, that's a very positive message. We're pretty much out of time, but I mean, obviously you're best known for exposing Cambridge Analytica's practices, but you're doing so much now to help users own their data and also obviously to take back control. And we all hope that this will help shape a future where disinformation is no longer as prevalent as it is today. Brittany Kaiser, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you to Mobile World Live, to GSMA, and to all of the teams who made this possible. I hope that we'll be able to be again on that giant stage in person for the next event. But I'm so proud of you guys for putting this together and making sure that all of this type of content is still reaching people at a time where most people are stuck at home. So I couldn't be more thankful for you guys giving a platform and a voice to these issues.
Oh, thank you, Brittany. And actually, on the subject of physical events, well, right now, in fact, this week, Asia's tech event of 2021 is taking place in Shanghai. And our viewers can experience it online. Just head over to MWC Shanghai, and we'll be able to give you a code there to access all of the content that we're delivering for MWC Shanghai. You can hopefully see that on your screen now. And then after Shanghai, of course, we're in the run-up to MWC Barcelona, the world's biggest and most influential connectivity event. It's really gathering the entire ecosystem later this year. It's going to run from the 28th of June to the 1st of July. And it really will be the place where you can connect with industry decision makers, both in person, and of course, we'll have a virtual element for MWC Barcelona. Don't forget to pre-register for that event to make sure you're the first to find out about the event details and more live content from MWC Barcelona. Just before we go, as I said right at the beginning, you can request a transcript of today's discussion with Brittany. We will email that to you. If you request it, just head over to the link on the screen and we'll email it to you as soon as it's ready. So I think with that, Brittany, we will sign off. Thank you very much again for joining us. And as Brittany said, we hope to see you on stage physically very soon. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.